Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for not being able to get into Dr. Fauci's tent. I guess, Oskar, I think maybe the best way to begin the conversation is maybe with a sort of brief background and history of the public theater for those who aren't as familiar with it.
Sure. I'm going to describe what the public theater is right now and then maybe just tell an origin story that will give you a sense of where we spring from. Right now, the public theater consists of the Delacorte Theater in Central Park, which has been doing free Shakespeare in the Park since 1954. It's a 2,000-seat amphitheater where every summer we do 2 to 3 Shakespeare plays, absolutely for free. Yeah, for the audience, you wait in line all day. Sometimes when we have very popular plays, people wait in line overnight. Or in the last decade, you can also get into a digital lottery to get tickets. And we give it away for free, but it doesn't mean that it's cheap. This is the best Shakespeare you'll see everywhere. We've had Meryl Streep, James Earl Jones, Al Pacino, Anne Hathaway, just extraordinary talents on that stage. It's the greatest theater art that can be made, given away for free. That's where we started. Downtown, we have a 6-theater complex, or more properly, 5 theaters and a cabaret, Joe's Pub. And that opened in 1967. And we are devoted almost exclusively to new plays and musicals downtown. And we've done things ranging from the world premiere for Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough, to Chorus Line, to a little ditty you may have heard of called Hair, to 10 years ago, this month we opened Hamilton downtown. So we have a very strong track record of doing work that opens there and then goes off for further life around the world. We also have a mobile unit that tours around to the 5 boroughs of New York City, to prisons, halfway shelters, halfway houses, homeless shelters, and the like. And of course, we move shows to Broadway and tour them. So we have a multitude of venues doing really a broad range of work. And that big tent approach is of the, here in the tent, is of the essence of what the public theater does, because we really believe that at the heart of the theater is the idea of democracy and the idea that it's for everybody, that we say it's a theater of, for, and by the people, and we mean it. And the little bit of an origin story that I think will give you a taste of this is Free Shakespeare in the Park was only 3 years old in 1957 when the all-powerful commissioner of the parks in New York City, Robert Moses, who you may have heard of, and it seems probably a little silly that the commissioner of the parks was the most powerful person in New York, but he was. He was probably the most powerful person in the history of New York. He controlled everything, the master builder, Robert Moses. He decreed that Free Shakespeare in the Park could no longer be free, that we needed to charge for Free Shakespeare in the Park and split the box office with the Parks Department so, he claimed, he could reseed the grass after we were done. Joe Papp, our founder, who at that time was a stage manager for CBS television, he was doing the Shakespeare as a volunteer side gig, announced that he refused to charge because to charge would destroy the essence of what Shakespeare in the Park stood for, which was that the culture belonged to everybody as a right, not something that they could buy. He fought Moses on this for the course of the entire winter of 57-58. The struggle made the front page of the New York Times 7 times over the course of that winter. Thousands of people sent in packets of grass seed to Robert Moses. And it was at the same time, for those of you who follow these things, Jane Jacobs was organizing the Mothers of Washington Square down in Washington Square Park, trying to prevent Robert Moses from running Fifth Avenue straight down through Washington Square to the tip of Battery Park. So uptown and downtown, there was a citizens' movement to try to take back the city. And by the spring of 1958, the appeals court, which is the highest court in New York State, ruled in Joe's favor that Moses had behaved in an arbitrary and capricious manner, and therefore we have a legal ruling that we are allowed to do Free Shakespeare in the Park, and we have been taking advantage of that for the 66 years since. And the reason that that is so important is what I referred to in Joe's idea, seeing the theater as something that is a right for everybody, not a luxury for the few. And we're housed in the building downtown that was the Astor Place Library, built in 1848, and it was the first free lending library in New York City. And in a way, that spiritual principle is still part of the public. There was a time when the idea that you had free lending libraries was a radical idea, that anybody could walk into a library and for free walk out with one of the great masterpieces and read it and return it a couple of weeks later. Now it's a commonplace. But Joe felt the same way about the theater, that the culture should be available to everybody and not be something that was a transactional commodity that had to be purchased. And that's an idea that still underlies everything that the public theater does today.
I think you can tell already that there couldn't have been a better choice than Oskar Eustis to shepherd and maintain the entity that Joe Papp had created. I'm curious, though, over the years of your tenure, how that mission has changed. I mean, the mission, I don't think probably has changed, but how you have managed it in relation to everything that has changed in society.
I'm happy to talk about that, but I'm looking at Michael Cerveris, so I have to tell one story first. This is about how we affect society, right? So I want to give a really specific example of how Michael helped change the world. Michael was the lead in a musical we did a few years ago called Fun Home. Based on Alison Bechdel's astonishing graphic novel, and it was a brilliant, brilliant musical. Michael was stunning in it. It became the first musical where two women won the Best Book, Best Composition, and Best Musical Tony Awards. It was really groundbreaking in that way. But the specific groundbreaking, I love this story. Samantha Power, who was at that time the United States ambassador to the United Nations, was a good friend of the theater and used to bring members of the Security Council and ambassadors of the United Nations to the theater as sort of a way to get everybody talking and socializing and connect. And she brought the whole Security Council to see Hamilton early on, and everybody liked it except the Russian ambassador. But she brought the entire Security Council to see Fun Home when we were running it uptown on Broadway. And she didn't tell anybody what the content of it was. Now, the content of Fun Home, for those of you who don't know, it's about a lesbian cartoonist researching the memory of her father, who was a gay man in Pennsylvania who killed himself. And so it's a gay daughter researching the biography of her gay father. And at the time that Samantha brought the Security Council, 3/4 of the countries that were represented on the Security Council had homosexuality as illegal in their countries. And again, she didn't tell them what it was about, she brought them. They had a very lively conversation after the show, and as chance would have it, the next week was the Orlando nightclub shooting. And for the first and only time in its history, the Security Council released a statement condemning violence against the LGBTQ community. That had never happened before and never happened since, and Samantha has publicly said it would not have happened if those people had not seen Fun Home the week before. And again, did that statement immediately change laws all over the world? Of course not. That's not how the theater works. But what it did do was move the needle a little bit in the hearts and minds of people who needed that needle moved. Because that's what the theater actually does. It changes, it humanizes people, it allows people to connect on a human level, and it changes the way you can't other people the same way once you've identified with them. When we, many years ago, I had the privilege of working for years and helping to create Tony Kushner's Angels in America. And it was a fantastic show. The second production I did of it was in Rhode Island, where my wife Lori and I were living at the time. And Rhode Island is a wonderfully progressive state, but culturally, it's the most Catholic state in the nation. And at that time, it was not particularly gay-friendly. And because it was Rhode Island, I knew everybody in the state, because that's the way it works. And we did Angels there, and I would watch the audience every night leap to their feet, giving a standing ovation. And I could stand at the back of the auditorium and look and go, yeah, well, I know him. He's a homophobe. She's a homophobe. He's against gay rights. But they're jumping to their feet, and they're giving a standing ovation. And is that because they've sat there at the theater and gone, oh, I repudiate my ideology. I actually decide I have a different political point of view on gay. No, it's because they've just spent those hours in the theater identifying with, caring about, falling in love with openly gay characters. And by the time it reaches the end, their hearts, their souls have outstripped their ideology. And they find that they have gone beyond what they believe to something else. And you know what? Their ideology will catch up. That's actually how change happens. You don't change people's minds by rational argument. You change people's minds by changing their hearts and souls and letting their minds catch up with them. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think is so powerful about our art form.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're thinking about making theater for all, and you know that some of that all are people who are actively working to undo the theater and what you intend to bring to the culture, how do you factor that? How do you deal with the fact that some of your donors you may not agree with ideologically, but for whatever reason they've been supporting the theater forever? You know, how do you thread that needle?
Well, first of all, we don't do ideological tests on money. I'm very grateful to the donors. I'm very grateful to the donors who have capacious enough minds to support us even when they disagree with some of what we do. That's actually a sign of a great philanthropic mind. The only donations that we reject are donations which are being made with an ulterior purpose. And what I'm sure many of you will know the example, when information came out about the Sacklers, we gave their money back and took their name off the wall because the actual act of donation was clearly an attempt to whitewash criminal activity. And we can't participate in that. So when that happens, that's different. But otherwise, we don't tell people, we don't take your money because we disagree with some of your... That's crazy. That's not the way it works. That's not the way democracy should work. But what I'm more worried about is what has happened in the great polarization of this country really over the last 45 years. And forgive me, I know you've heard this story, and Lori, forgive me, I know you've heard this a lot, but when Trump was first elected, there was a little incident that happened when Vice President-elect Pence came to see Hamilton in January of 2017, and we just found out a few hours in advance, and we hastily composed a letter that Rand and Victor Dixon read from the stage, which was actually a very respectful letter, just saying, Mr. Vice President-elect, there are a number of people on stage are afraid, and this is what we're afraid of. And we hope that your administration... And so it was not a rabid attack, it was an expression. And Vice President Pence was actually very good about it. He actually stood in the lobby and listened to the whole thing before he left. When he came in, he was met by a chorus of New York boos, and he turned to his son and said, "That's the sound of democracy, son." And so it was good. His boss was not quite so sanguine about it, and sent us, demanded an apology from the producers, and he demanded another one from me 6 months later. Not by name. I wish he'd done it by name. I would have been proud. But in response to that, there was an online petition to boycott Hamilton, and it garnered many, many thousand signatures immediately. And I looked at this and I said, there's something wrong with this picture, because these people are signing a petition to boycott Hamilton, and they were never going to see Hamilton. Most of them are living in communities where Hamilton was never going to show up. If it was going to show up, they couldn't afford a ticket. And if they could afford a ticket, they wouldn't, at that time, have had the connections to get a ticket. They're not boycotting Hamilton. Hamilton boycotted them way before they started boycotting us. And then I took a look at the electoral map of the United States. And if you look at a red and blue map of the country, and it was true in 2024 too, and if you look at it county by county and not state by state, and just see where the red counties and where the blue counties. And if you were to say, this is a map of the nonprofit theaters in the United States, and the blue is where the nonprofit theaters are, and the red is where there are no professional nonprofit theaters, you'd be pretty accurate. The entire nonprofit theater movement has turned our back on half the country. And we didn't intend to. We didn't say, we are moving away from everywhere where there aren't Democrats. What we did was we sort of let ourselves get caught up, just like everybody else in the country, and we just sort of flowed to where our supporters are, where it was easier to get support. And so the cultural sphere, the nonprofit cultural sphere, which is not supposed to be market-driven, did the same thing that the educational system did, that the economy did, that the political system did, and turned our back on half the country. That is a terrible problem. And we have seen the consequences of that. And I think one of the huge issues facing the field right now is how are we going to actually be a theater for everybody, not just for the people who live in demographic centers that already know they like the theater. How are we going to demonstrate our value to everybody? Because if you believe that the theater is the essential democratic art form, and I do, you should be able to prove it with people who don't already think that. You should be able to demonstrate that. You should be able to make that happen. And if you can't, it's not their fault. There's something wrong with the proposition in the first place. And I'm not saying that's going to be easy, but I think it's really, really important.
And does the public work with regional theaters or not-for-profit theaters outside of New York that might be avenues where that kind of support gets to places like that?
We do, but nowhere near adventurously enough. We had one great initiative that then got cut short by COVID, and now as we're starting to get some of our muscle back, we have to revive. Lynn Nottage wrote a play called Sweat, she did a decade of research in Reading, Pennsylvania, about the deindustrialization of Reading and of steel towns in general. And she really embedded herself in that community, did everything from become close friends with the mayor to sleep out overnight in the woods with unhoused former steelworkers. I mean, she really did an amazing job of getting to know this community. And then she wrote a play about what happened in that community between 2004 and 2010, which was the great period of it collapsing industrially. And the play remains to this day the best story about what radicalized these formerly pro-union progressive communities to the right. And there are characters in the play. Trump is never mentioned, electoral politics is never mentioned, but you watch this community turn into a community that you can imagine voting for Trump in front of your eyes, and it does it in an incredibly sympathetic manner, not from the outside, but from the inside. You understand the loss and the rage. And it's a beautiful play. We did it, won the Pulitzer Prize, played on Broadway. And a week after we closed on Broadway, we put all the actors in a van and went to Reading, Pennsylvania, and performed it in the big auditorium there for free for Reading with cubes. It was like a high school production, no light cues, no costumes, a boombox, and it was amazing. And then we put together a tour through the industrial Midwest, through Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, and performed in soup kitchens and union halls and churches for free again, to audiences again, many of whom had never seen a play before. And it was extraordinary because you had a lot of people who voted very different ways in those audiences. And we'd have these discussions afterwards, hour-long debates and discussions about the play. And what I loved is that nobody, literally nobody, said the word Democrat or Republican. Nobody said Clinton or Trump. Nobody said Bush. That's right. People talked about their jobs. People talked about their schools. People talked about their main streets boarded up. People talked about their experiences. And you could see in those audiences, people looking at each other, I didn't know that's how you experienced this. I didn't know how you experienced it. And I just thought, this is exactly what the theater is supposed to do. Get people together and talk about what their shared experiences are, not about who's to blame and who you're gonna vote for. There's places to talk about that. But the theater's where to talk about the experiences that these cities went through, that these communities went through, and start to form a sense of commonality that actually might lead to a different analysis of what could happen. And it was magnificent, and then COVID hit, and we all got on our back feet, and we haven't been able to build on that. But I really hope that before I have to shuffle off, I can get that initiative started again, because I think it was important.
Yeah. It reminds me of two other quick stories about Fun Home and the way it's interacted with the world. In the time between when we did it at the Public and when we did it on Broadway, the book was the South Carolina legislature removed funding for a program at the College of Charleston because they were teaching, that book was being offered to all of the incoming class. Every year they would offer a book to the incoming class so that all of the undergraduates would have this shared experience of having read a book. And this particular year, it happened to be Allison's book. And so the legislature removed the amount of funding exactly that was the dollar amount of what it cost for that program. And so we were invited to, we heard about this, and I sent a little text around to all the Fun Home people and said, anybody up for a road trip? And we ended up going down to the College of Charleston and doing two sort of rough staged readings with the support of the Public and our Broadway producers. And it was extraordinary. We were supposed to just do one. We did two. They were packed events with the whole community was there. And then later, after the Pulse shooting, we did a sort of similar thing and brought the entire Broadway company down with support from our producers and from the Public, and did a one-off benefit performance for the community and the LGBTQ community in Orlando. And in both of those instances, we intended it as a show of solidarity and a way to kind of connect with these communities that were so impacted through the thing that we were doing. We had a tool that we could use to kind of connect with the communities. In both instances, we sort of thought we were doing something for them. I think all of us felt as much or more by the end of it that we had gotten so much out of the experience of doing this. And what it taught me most of all was the value of, it's great to send money, it's great to donate, it's great to support causes, but showing up in person and boots on the ground kind of thing is such a different thing. And I think you're absolutely right that getting out into communities, I grew up in Huntington, West Virginia, but was part of a community theater there that was extraordinarily progressive but open to everyone in the community. And this is not a community that is given to sort of progressive ideals usually. So I understand really from my youngest days how important it is to have people in your community doing those things, and why it would be so important to continue to do that kind of work. So I hope that happens.
That's a beautiful story. And so much of what I've also been thinking about and we're trying to do is looking at the container. I've spent my entire career within a field that was created just a few years before I was born, the professional nonprofit theater, which really was created in the 1950s and flourished in the 1960s. It didn't really exist before that. And as I've been thinking the last few years, it seems to me that particular box has become a restriction, because the idea that we focus exclusively on the professional theater seems to me a limitation that is not so helpful anymore. We've established there is such a field. Great, I'm glad there's such a field. There should be. But what I feel like we need to widen our lens and say that actually the real point is to try to keep using, reinforcing, promoting theater in all of its manifestations to allow it to unleash the democratic power of communities. And that can include amateur theater of all types, educational theater, community theater, that this distinction between professional and non-professional is kind of limiting and in some cases useless. We started a program 12 years ago called Public Works at the Public, and it was created by this really visionary director, Lear de Bessonet, who has just become the new artistic director at Lincoln Center Theater. I'm incredibly proud of her and excited for what she's going to do there. And the idea was and is that the public partners with community-based organizations in all 5 boroughs. So everything from Domestic Workers United, which is the union of nannies and housekeepers, to the Children's Aid Society, to the Fortune Society, which is a fantastic organization that focuses on helping formerly incarcerated people reintegrate into society, to the Military Resilience Project, which deals with veterans who are suffering psychological and physical injuries to rehabilitate and reintegrate into society. We work all year round with these organizations, and then at the end of every summer, we put on this huge pageant on stage at the Delacorte in Central Park that has 5 of the greatest professional actors in New York and 150 members of the community, many of whom have never been on stage before, ranging in age from 3 to 93, literally, and putting on these beautiful productions of musical adaptations of Twelfth Night and As You Like It and The Tempest. And when we first started this in 2012, I actually was the first Public Works, I was very proud of it. I knew it was going to be wonderful social work and it was going to be good for all the people who participated in it. What I had no idea was that it was going to be the most exciting piece of theater that I'd seen that year in New York. And that has remained true every year since. And the unleashing of artistic power, of blurring the lines between professional and non-professionals, of saying that actually artistry is not a binary. It's not something that some people are artists and some people aren't. There are people who are born to make art and there are people who are born to observe artists. It's just nonsense. That the ability to create art, the desire to create art, and the need to have something to express artistically is actually part of what makes all of us human. And some people have the privilege of getting to practice it 80 hours a week, and most people don't. Some people have certain natural gifts. I will never be able to sing like Michael Cerveris, no matter how many hours I practice, and some people have fewer natural gifts. But it's all on a continuum. It's not a binary. It's not on-off. And that if you actually elevate that and say that continuum is what is to be celebrated, not just the virtuosic end of the continuum, it unleashes something that's incredibly beautiful. And so, in addition to the geographic expansion that I hope we continue to focus on in the field. There's also the expansion of enfranchisement of who gets to practice the art of theater that I hope is a big expansion in the next few years, because make no mistake, as we come out of COVID, we are either going to matter to a lot more people or a lot less people. And the path for return to health for the theater is either mattering a lot more to a lot more people or mattering to a lot fewer people and charging them a lot more money for tickets. And that route, which, I don't know, the $938 tickets for Othello, that seems to be going in that direction. That route lies a kind of cultural irrelevance that I really hope we don't move into as a field. Of course, there'll be individual shows that do that. But if that's the direction of the whole field, this will become an era where the theater is really culturally irrelevant in a way that I hope doesn't happen.
Yeah. I think it's, as you've been speaking, I think here in New Orleans and Louisiana in general, there's an understanding of the things that you're saying on a real deep cultural level. If you go out to, and I have to take you out to Cajun country at some point, but when you go to a gathering there, the musicians who are playing music are the same as the people who are listening to music, and that they will, change over the course of the evening. Like everybody can play a song or two, or can play the T for the triangle. Some people are cooking. Some people stop cooking to go pick up a guitar and pick up a fiddle. It's there is no boundary between audience and performer, and also New Orleans theater, which I know you've spent some time down here.
Not enough.
And New Orleans has had a professional not-for-profit theater. But we also have the oldest community theater in the country that A.J. Allegra is running now. And that, I feel like this area is particularly ripe for the kinds of things that you're talking about. Are there things that you could offer to those people who might be listening today and trying to do these kinds of things that could sort of give them hope?
I don't know if I have anything to offer other than my enthusiasm and encouragement, because it's a direction that we've just started to move in, and I don't know enough about yet. Just a personal anecdote. My sister lives in rural southern Minnesota and is suffering from dementia, and so her comprehension of stuff is not high. But she decided about a year and a half ago that she just said, what I want to do is go see plays. And I think she said that to me because she knew I did plays, but I think she meant it also. So what we've been doing for the last year and a half is every month I go out and we go to a community theater in southern Minnesota, and I just look them up at what's playing in Zumbrota. Oh, Nonsense by the Zumbrota Community Theater. Or, the craziest was Hedwig and the Angry Inch at the Rochester Civic Theater, which I swear there was not a word of the original play in it, but it was amazing. But what's been so fantastic, and it's been great for my sister and I, but what's been so fantastic for me about seeing these is just sort of educating myself in the joy of this different lens. In Zumbrota is a town of 1,800 people. And this production of Nonsense played for 6 nights in a 400-seat auditorium. And the night we were there, it was sold out. And I'm in the theater, I'm not any good at math, but you don't need to be that good at math to go 6 nights, 400 seats, town of 1,800. There's more seats than there are people in the town. But you could also just feel it at intermission. You could feel it after. Everybody knows everybody. And that changes entirely the relationship of what's going on in a beautiful way. Just as when we do free Shakespeare in the park, it's not just that it's more accessible because it's free, although that's really important. Anybody who tells you it doesn't matter if something is free, is lying to you. You make things free and a whole different audience gets to go. That's just true. Not to throw them under the bus because they're a completely different group of people than when I arrived, but when I arrived at the Public Theater 20 years ago, I said to the board, I'd like to try to make all our seats downtown free. And to a person, they were against it. But it was not because of the economics. It was because if you don't charge for something, people won't value it. And they were just all certain of this, as if it was a religious text. And I said, you have been the board of directors and the stewards of Free Shakespeare in the Park, which has been going on at that point for 60 years, to the most enthusiastic, most diverse, youngest, most joyous theater audience in the United States. And yet you're telling me that people don't value something that they don't pay for. And what I felt at the time and still feel is that people's ideology can sometimes be so strong that it overrides their very experience. That idea, you don't value what you pay for, has been drilled into us so hard that you can ignore your own experience that that's not true. Anyway, so it's important that you make things free so that people can go see it for accessibility, but it's also that when you're sitting in that audience, you realize there's something entirely different about the relationship to the stage, because the people in the audience didn't buy what's on the stage. They didn't purchase it like a commodity. They're receiving it differently because it's a gift economy that's going on. They are being offered it up as a gift, and they are receiving it as a gift and giving the energy back as a gift. And it's why there's a slight feeling of euphoria at the Delacorte, really almost no matter what the production is. They're very good 98% of the time. Occasionally we stumble. But still, there's something going on about that transaction. And that's this, it's different but analogous what I was feeling in those community theaters. And then you realize that this whole idea that you should pay to buy a great theater experience is historically a very recent phenomenon. That's not what the relationship of audience to theater has been for the vast bulk of the 2,500 years that Western theater has been in existence. That's, it only started 400 years ago in the Elizabethan period. And even then, it was much more complicated and mixed. And it's really only just become this sort of purchase thing in the last 100 years. And so it's really not impossible to imagine a different model of how the theater can relate to its audience. And boy, do I think we need that right now.
I think I always sort of understood theater to be a service profession, and I was raised and taught by people who believe that fervently, and I feel like that's sort of what you're talking about. It's not, because if you create that transactional dynamic between the audience and a theater, you teach the artist to be transactional in a way as well, and to offer their services for a fee and build their lives and careers around it. I guess we only have a few more minutes here. I guess maybe the most interesting thing at this point would be to ask where, and I think you've answered this in a lot of ways, but where you see the theater going in the next few years, or ideally where it should be headed and how. I know recently Center Stage in Baltimore just made headlines for saying that rather than get rid of their DEI missions and aspects of their mission, they're just going to forego government funding, which in all honesty probably was not the largest part of their budget to begin with. And that's not a luxury that every theater has, to be able to do that, and it may or may not turn out to be a sustainable thing for them. But just for the public and for theater in general, like where do you see it going ideally, and how?
Well, around the National Endowment for the Arts, specifically, I very much admire what Center Stage and some other theaters are doing, but we've chosen a different route. we have announced that we are going to apply aggressively for all of the funding that we think we deserve, and we are refusing to honor or comply with the guidelines that require us to eliminate our diversity programming and our gender ideology wing, because we just can't. We would cease to function. And I know some theaters are also doing what many corporations and universities are doing, which is just trying to change the words and do the stuff. And for us, because the theater, in a way, language is essential to who we are, we're refusing to change the words, because I don't want to cede the territory of that language, because I do believe that people are trying to weaponize that language and trying to make the language toxic, and I don't think the words diversity, equity, and inclusion should become toxic. We should not allow them to be toxic. And I don't know what the results of that are going to be, but I think it's important that we stand up and say no to that. And it'll probably be a long, slow process, and in the course of which we probably won't get NEA money. And we're in a position where that's okay. We don't need the NEA money that much. And so I don't want to judge any other institution. Everybody has to pick their own way here. But I do think it's important to stand up and say what's unacceptable, because I think accepting things passively is a very slippery and dangerous slope. So again, I don't want to judge any individual theater or any individual institution, but I think that's important. But at the same time, there's a deeper problem, and that's what I've referred to before. I think the funding model, the business model that the nonprofit theater has had in its 75 years of existence has basically broken down. There is no longer the broad societal consensus on the need for our existence that happened in the late 50s and 60s when foundations, governments, both state and federal, wealthy philanthropists, even corporations, had a broad consensus that the nonprofit arts were good for society and should be spread across the country. And it's that kind of consensus that led the Kennedy Center, Lincoln Center, the Music Center in LA to be built. It led the regional theaters to be established all across the country, not because they were, one stakeholder's idea, but because broadly society said this is a good idea. That broad consensus doesn't exist anymore. So if we're going to survive, we have to go back out and convince a whole lot of people that we deserve to survive. We have to go back out and convince a lot of different stakeholders that their lives are better because of what we do. And that's kind of scary, but frankly, it's also bracing. If we can't do that, maybe we don't deserve to survive. Maybe it's not so bad that we have to go prove it again. I certainly don't think it's going to be a winning strategy to, cross our arms and pout and say, well, you promised, or like, we deserve to live because we do, It's like, good luck. I think we actually have to prove it. And some theaters are going to tack hard towards the commercial model and are going to say, okay, nonprofit sources are drying up, we're going to earn our money, and okay, they're going to do that. But if the whole field does that, we are going to go back to having the art that the market allows. And I think that is going to be a horrible impoverishment of the theater that's available to this country. So those of us who don't want to do that are going to have to find a much broader base of people who say, hey, we think you matter, and therefore will help us find the funding, whether it's from public, private, other sources that we don't even think about now, that will allow us to survive. And I think one of the things that's going to mean is that we're going to have to embrace the need to be of service to our communities. We're not going to get to say, well, we should be supported because we're art. we should be supported because we're so pure. We need to go, no, we should be supported because we make this community's life better, and we can prove it. And they testify to that, and we actually even have metrics to prove that health outcomes are better. We have metrics to demonstrate that this community has better cohesion because of us. And again, that's going to be hard, but necessary. And I see we've reached zero.
We have reached zero. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you so much to Oskar Eustis for coming.
Thank you.